Well, welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 303rd meeting since we started in February of 2009. We put a different speaker on every week, a different subject. We require our speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. After that, we have a question and answer period, not speeches. And then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in this audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium to respond to the speaker said for or against. Our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment and close the meeting. That's how it works. We don't pay our speakers to give them a free dinner with our compliments. And we charge everybody $3. We pay for a speaker's dinner and advertise. We don't make anything a lot of fun. That's how it works. Anyway, now is the time for announcements. If anybody has any announcements, now's the time to make them. Anybody have any announcements they want to make? I can't believe this. No announcements?
I don't want to make any announcements.
Nobody wants to make any announcements? Nobody has an announcement to make? Jim has an announcement.
My mouth was full. I was not going to do it. Just a brief word. Welcome. We're glad you're here tonight. We've been enjoying our new domain here in the few weeks we've been here. If anybody has any comments or suggestions, please pass them forward to Tom or myself. Tom talked to you about the $3 that we collect to buy the speakers' meals and to pay for the printing and supplies and going around. Tom goes around and spends a couple of days every week and posts them in Starbucks and other places where they have boards to introduce the group to new people. And it's a nice use of his time, and that burns a little bit of gas. Anyway, we spend some money. Last year we ended up having a good year in terms of attendance and the amount of revenue we connected, but because we had to replace the printer to print out our notices, that and a couple of other things put us in the black. In the red, excuse me. We didn't end up in the black. So we carried a credit balance over this year, and so far we have been diminishing it. So always be sure that you pay Tom what you owe him. And then our restaurant is kind in that they give us the meeting room here to dine and eat. And they don't charge us a meeting room charge for that. So please remember to be generous with our servers who take good care of us, because they're not being paid off of a fee that we pay into the restaurant. Treat them like you were going into the restaurant, on your own and having a meal. Pretty simple stuff. It's nothing exotic. Most of you may know that and have heard me say it, but I can't look back and see who all's here tonight from here. So if anybody has not, please get on board and march to the beat of the drummer, okay? But we're looking forward to our meeting tonight. I think we have a speaker tonight I don't believe we've had before, so that's good. We get new ones and we get repeats. Both are good. Yeah, Jim is a longtime participant and a good repeat speaker, so we always enjoy when he gets up here at the front. But Tom, that's enough of my mouthing, and stop eating and come on back up and finish the introductions.
Any more announcements? Anybody have announcements they want to make? No? All right. Next week is Toward a Stronger U.S. Constitution. That's, I gotta read my own writing here. Ed Paul Winch, he'll be a retired psychotherapist. He'll be talking about that. And February 20th, we have an opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's George Nolan. That ought to be good. So it's on your itinerary. You can read it. I'm not going to read all this. Our speaker tonight is Jim Love. He's going to talk about the end of the world. He's worked as an engineer and educator with publications in both fields, holds both a BS and MS in physics from the University of Texas. To discuss what, when, and how the free market capitalism in our time has damaged not only the middle class, but the USA's security as well. He will show how the what includes 14 major changes in the social and economic landscape over the last 50 years, and that the why and how explains motivation for the changes and connects the dots to illustrate why so many are angry, frustrated, and disillusioned with the leadership in both parties. Jim will essentially be analytical, but he'll outline and explain the most prominent feature of today's political landscape, anger. Well, without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Jim Love.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Volume's good, all right. Thank you for coming, as always. I know everybody's got lots of other things to do, so I appreciate your being here. When I put this together, I was thinking of believe it or not, anybody remember Eddie Childs?
Yes,
He owned
absolutely.
yeah, he owned the Rangers, right? Remember his bumper sticker?
Western Company of North America.
Yeah, but his bumper sticker says, "I'm mad too, Eddie." And those are his ads. And I was thinking to myself that he was born ahead of his time. He could have made a lot of money selling them these days. Anyways, tonight's talk, just to give you a preview of what's involved, it's an attempt to explain not only my anger, but anger in general. And I would make the argument that there's plenty of anger out there. You don't see populist movements on the right and the left unless people are angry. They're fed up and they're sick and tired with business as usual, and that's where you see populism. The other thing is, getting feedback here, I try to remain analytical, and I think you did, but you'll be a better judge of that, and you'll let me know. I'm worried that it's too long, and I may have thrown it in the kitchen sink, so let me know about that, if I did. And the thing I do want to emphasize is that this is not a partisan speech. If you think I'm coming down on the left or the right side, you're wrong. It's an anti-partisan speech. So I wanted to make that clear at the outset. And how it's organized, the first part, there's 14 things that I list that have gone wrong that shouldn't have. And you can think of those as an indictment. And the next part explains why these things happened. And the thing you need to keep in mind about the 14 things is that these things do not happen in a vacuum. They do not happen spontaneously on their own. These things were planned and they were designed. And I'll see if you agree with me on that. And the last part, of course, explains how they all work together to put us in the mess that we happen to be in. Okay, so with that, those are the prefatory notes. But to start this thing off, the purpose is an attempt to explain how and why certain shifts in economic policy and underlying thinking have played out in my adult lifetime. That's the span that I'm talking about. And provide an estimate of what the future might be like if present trends continue. The position taken by this speaker is that life under free trade capitalism and many of its underlying beliefs will become ever more materially and even spiritually bleaker for most should we not change course. The talk is analytical in its purpose, but it was conceived in anger, which I think aligns it well with the national mood. We will begin with a list of 14 things, and I'm sorry about that, but it's complicated. Things that have altered the social landscape over the span of my adult lifetime, and then I'm going to proceed to explain why and how they all combine to put us where we are which for many is behind the 8 ball. The title of this talk, As End of the World, was chosen because the world that once sustained the working middle class has ended. Like it or not, everyone is having to come to grips with new technologies, new centers of power, and a globalization that has changed everything. I have no argument there. That is absolutely true. But there is plenty of room for argument and anger over how this country's leadership went about adapting to these changes, and that will most certainly be covered. All right, so the things that are identified are in no particular order. First one is the credit card and usury. In my youth, credit cards were rare, high debt levels were unknown, usury limits were somewhere around 8%. Now 25% on unpaid credit card is standard. Most of us now, even teens, have multiple credit cards. Many live on the edge of being maxed out, all in large part because of bank lobbying that changed the laws because they could smell the profits. Point 2, stable 2-parent families. Then, using 1980 as a baseline, the percentage of white single mothers was about 18%. By 2010, the percentage of white single mothers was 30% for those without a college degree, but only 6 to 9% for those with one. This is an obvious direct hit on the blue-collar white male and his family. And in the ghettos, more often than not, black kids are raising themselves, while mom works 2 or 3 jobs and the gang takes the place of the family unit. Meanwhile, the black church struggles to have an influence, quite the contrast from when Dr. King mobilized the civil rights movement, largely from within churches. Point 3, mortgage qualification. Then a conventional required 20% down and an FHA or VA loan of about 5%. Just prior to the Great Recession, the applicable acronym for qualification was NINJA. This meant that many qualified for homes they could not afford, with nothing down, even though they had no income, no job, or no assets. The federal government during the Clinton administration pushed hard for home ownership, which is a usual GOP talking point when it comes to assigning blame for the housing bubble and crash. That's true. But it's also true that banks, whatever their provenance, more than happy to finance government-guaranteed loans, package fat fees, and then repackage the subprime mortgages into falsely rated AAA securities that were sold to unsuspecting pension fund managers looking for yield. Point 4, death rates. This was a big one. Death rates for middle-aged men in the USA, but not for other advanced Western nations. For most of the last century, in the beginning of this one, death rates fell across the board. Medical care improved, and so did health and longevity. Recent statistics reported that the death rate for white and middle-class men only in the USA has risen, while elsewhere it has fallen. This was so shocking that it made headlines and had a lot of coverage on op-ed page and is nearly unprecedented. The only modern parallel in death rates is corresponding sectors of the Russian population in the decade following the collapse of the Soviet Union's communist system. CEO compensation, everybody knows about this. Then CEO pay was some 10 to 20 times the average line worker, and now it could be as high as 300 times. With globalization, the masters of international trade are presumably 10 to 20 times more skillful than their counterparts a generation or so back. Next point. Attitude towards government, especially Washington, by the general population. Other than ultra-conservatives, few thought that government is the problem way back when. Politics was not yet a dirty word. Ever since Reagan made it official, however, and the enactment of civil rights legislation in the 60s, it has been. 2 recent presidential terms of gridlock have not helped either. Now, the House approval ratings are at all-time low. Obama's, while considerably higher, have fallen, and the majority of folks think that the USA is on the wrong path, our government is broken, and the American dream may be, if not dead, at least on life support. All of this, even though the bull market has had a 6-year run and counting, unemployment is at 5%, and the deficit has been reduced. Apparently not enough to benefit. Homeowner equity. Then, if you had equity, you sat on it, although there were occasional second mortgages. Now there's a flood of reverse mortgages and second mortgages, often to maintain a standard of living that has been lowered by job loss or take the place of a pension plan that no longer exists. As a result, many use their homes before and after the Great Recession as ATM machines to keep up until the economy recovered, or so they hoped. Next point, union strength. Today, they are mortally wounded and mostly defeated. Then they were powerful and were in a position to bargain for a bigger slice of the profits pie. Unions, office Teamsters being a major exception, enjoyed popular support, and business spoke of them as partners in prosperity. Reagan thought otherwise and broke the air traffic controller strike, even though, ironically enough, they endorsed him. That, taken together with massive offshoring and manufacturing jobs, looking the other way when it came to illegals crossing our southern border, and the flight of corporations to right-to-work Sunbelt states broke them. Today, they are not only weak, but the remaining strongholds of union power, teachers and civil servants, find that they lack popular support. Today, some argue that they brought it on themselves, others that they were targeted for weakening. I think mostly the latter. Share of GDP between investors and workers. Then unions had bargaining power, and a larger proportion of workers were in unions. Technologies like computers and robots had not yet eliminated jobs. The manufacturing base was intact. The scale of global trade was much less, with China not yet our manufacturing base. Supply and demand, in short, was on labor's side. Today, labor is under assault and takes what it can get, having no weapons with which to fight. Especially with outsourcing of jobs and the influx of immigrants, supply and demand today works against labor. As a consequence, we all know the statistics on wealth and income imbalance, and that the levels are at or near all-time highs, not seen since the Gilded Age or the end of the 20s. The rich are getting richer, as the share of wealth for the top 0.1% rose from 7% in 1979 to 22% in 2012. And the sheer numbers of homeless and beggars seen on the streets and libraries of any major American city were unknown back in my youth. And yes, that's anecdotal.
A little bit.
Sure, it's anecdotal, but it's true. Can you hear me now? All right. Security threat to the United States. Then it was the Cold War, the missile gap in the Soviet Union as our godless opponent. Vietnam was a domino that we had to stop from falling. Now the Soviet Union's gone. The other dominoes in Asia are still standing, and we both have ISIS and China as major threats. The possibility of nuclear holocaust has been replaced by the reality of terrorist attacks. China's flexing its muscles in the Pacific. But one thing that has not changed, however, is that fear is still politically useful. Wall Street operations. Then Glass-Steagall separated investment banks from depository banks. During the Clinton administration, that New Deal era act that has served us well was repealed after many prior attempts. Then the focus on banks was to provide finance capital to credit-worthy enterprises and earn modest returns. Now the focus is on inventing ever more exotic investment instruments that have turned Wall Street into a casino where bad bets are covered by taxpayer bailouts. Under deregulation, we've had two major taxpayer finance bailouts, the after effects of the most recent one lasting nearly a decade. Technology and globalization. Well, we know about PCs, satellites, and internet, cell phones. They weren't invented then. Now they are. And they provide computing power, information, communication that have transformed the world into a global village. Not only that, but future shock, according to Toffler, has been confirmed. The rate of change is accelerating, and for me, it's stopped the world. I want to get off. Presently, we are globally integrated in every which way except legally and politically. Trade treaties, however, for better or for worse, are steps in the direction of integration, and I find it interesting that the establishments in both the Democratic and the Republican Party have never seen a trade treaty that they didn't like. But I also find it interesting that the populists on the right, and we're talking about Donald Trump, and the populists on the left, we're talking about Mr. Sanders, hate all the trade treaties. So I thought that was interesting. All right, willingness to fight. I come from Detroit. There's a long and bloody history of strife between unions and companies. Back in the day, Ford brought in goons, Walter Reuther was beaten to a pulp, and his house was bombed. Back in the 30s, entire cities were shut down by general strikes, Minneapolis and San Francisco among them. Today, the best that has been managed in the way of physical protest is Occupy Wall Street, which turned out to be relatively peaceful, not very effective, and short-lived. I'm omitting acts of domestic terrorism here. But, and this is a very important point, at least Occupy got it right. They didn't go to Washington, they went to Wall Street. The Tea Party itself was conceived in populist anger, mainly over bank bailouts, and thus far has managed to disrupt town hall meetings and gridlock government. The Tea Party thinks that an oversized government, overreaching government, I should say, is the problem, along with high taxes and creeping socialism. But I disagree. Bernie Sanders has it right. Wall Street is telling Washington what to do and not the other way around. It is not size that's the issue, it's who's in control, and it's not always mindless bureaucrats. Now, and there's plenty of anger now, all right, just as there was then, but the anger is often cleverly misdirected. And let's see, one more and then we're done with the 14 points. Federal debt. I'll shorten this up a bit and mention only that the federal debt is increased under the last 3 presidents. And it will increase considerably under Obama to the point of just about the size of our GDP. But I will mention that one of the reasons that our debt has grown so large is because we put the cost of the Iraq War on the credit card. Back in World War II, there was austerity, people grew victory gardens, and taxes were increased, and there was even rationing. Anyways, those are the major changes, and I think of them as an indictment, and I do not think that all of these things happened by accident. I think they were by design. And now what I'd like to talk about is to explain the dynamics of change, which amounts for accounting for why and how. So it's legitimate to ask ourselves the question of why did this happen? And then we can get into the question of how it happened. Of the two, I think why is easiest. And I believe that human nature is such that individuals and factions will usually move in the direction of self-interest. And I don't think that very many people in this room will argue with me on that. This, not incidentally, is true for both Republicans and Democrats, and it's true for workers and investors. Know that a powerful minority of folks and institutions way back when thought that the New Deal was not a good deal. They hated progressive taxation, they hated restrictions on banks, they hated the power of unions and other have-nots to appropriate and redistribute, and they feared the takeover, if not godless communism, then the socialism that would cost them money and restrict their power. So after a few generations of setting up think tanks, expenditures of millions of dollars, getting in bed with social conservatives, think the silent majority and Jerry Falwell, and armies of lobbyists, including the invading the Capitol, I should say, the New Deal was dismantled and Roe v. Wade fiercely opposed by any and all means, which more than proves the old adage that politics makes for some very strange bedfellows. Banks were deregulated, Glass-Steagall was eliminated, taxes were lowered for both corporations and high-earning individuals, and unions were weakened as earlier described. Also, tax havens loopholes were established both physically and legally. Most importantly, a new worldview was installed in people's heads thanks to incessant propagandizing, and you can thank Fox, Rush Limbaugh, and yes, MSNBC is the counter-propagandist. And this propagandizing justified supporting policies that worked against them. Simply put, the mantra was that big government is the problem, never mind who controls it, and forget about collectivism of any kind. You're on your own, boy. Rugged individualism is back and here to stay. Those on the right wrongly preached that we have less to fear from free markets and big corporations than from big government. Undermining this misguided belief, however, is the inconvenient fact that people are people, and you can expect that if a given faction thinks they can get away with it, they will try. And the corporate and investment factions that now owns our government is no less corruptible than our elected officials. But they do have this advantage. Many of them are unaccountable. Neither the Koch brothers and, if you like, George Soros, are running for anything. They don't have to. Also in politics, there's always something ulterior. Self-interest rules, or as Gordon Gekko put it, greed is good. And this assessment is all-encompassing, presuming that there are no angels out there when it comes to the machinations of capitalism, even though Bush 1 made vague references to points of light when asked about sources of charitable contributions. Recall also the no angels reminder was provided by Milton Friedman to Phil Donahue in a now famous interview on the nature of capitalism. This is how greed became a virtue, just as selfishness has, according to Ayn Rand. And let us not forget that Atlas Shrugged, her most famous novel, was made required reading for the staff of one Paul Ryan, the new Speaker of the House. So why it happened is very simple. People are people. Now, I had another thought on that, but all right. The how is more complex, but it goes something like this. Unions were busted as already described. Outsourcing, illegals, automation, and corporate flight to the Sun Belt did that trick. Reagan signaled they no longer had any friends in D.C. Deregulation made possible overturning usury laws while setting up the S&Ls for looting and making gambling with other people's money on Wall Street legal, along with questionable practices like credit default swaps and falsely rated securities. And very few went to jail in the wake of the Great Recession because there were fewer laws to prevent bad behavior. Those had already been lobbied away. The outright buying of politicians assured that there would be no debate on outsourcing of jobs to China or Mexico, and there would be no interference from Washington with the distribution of profits, and that tax rates and policies would become ever more business-friendly, having the lightest touch in the way of regulation. Never mind that the imbalance of payments made the Chinese so cash-rich that not only do they own our debt, but they bootstrapped themselves into a military threat in the Pacific and now are in a position to own large parts of the USA by means of purchase. The composition of the Supreme Court was not neglected either, with key appointments and a number of 5-4 decisions have upheld the notion that money is speech, which has gone a long ways towards furthering the spread of bribery and corruption in the halls of Congress. Occupy Wall Street was a clear signal that 99% now believe that the market-oriented economic system is unfair and rigged by the politicians. Thomas Piketty and I both agree with that assessment. Lastly, but most importantly, a private sector propaganda machine was set up to convince the great unwashed that unregulated free trade capitalism is good for everyone and that the government needs to do less and get out of the way. And the government did get out of the way, as already described, allowing in an enormous number of immigrants, both legal and illegal. The number of illegals in the USA has tripled since Bush won. In my youth, the United States population was about 160 million. Now it's well over 300 million, most of them immigrants. So, jobs were exported, a flood of immigrants allowed in because business loved cheap labor. Working people were thereby subjected to the double whammy of fewer jobs at home with an increased number of folks competing for what was left. Sadly, both political parties got behind this. The false doctrine of free trade capitalism ranks alongside the divine right of kings as a self-serving myth that seeks to establish and maintain the status quo that advantages a few at the expense of the many. To put it bluntly, the American people have been had with stories of rising tides floating all boats, while those with yachts were making sure that the majority could not afford even a rowboat. So if you're thinking that this is class warfare, you are right. But I'm assigning blame for inciting the war and subsequent hostilities to the perpetrators, not the victims. Class warfare, by the way, is a permanent feature of capitalism where investors and workers always differ on how to divide the profit pie. Always. So what to do? I remain permanently angry, yet paradoxically cheerful at the same time. Angry because I know we've been had and the social fabric shredded. More than I would like to admit, Margaret Thatcher's observation that there is no such thing as society has come true. Only families and warring packs remain, and even family social units are threatened. Some attribute this to empty churches on Sunday morning to account for the demise of the family and traditional values. They may have a point, but other critics attribute the disintegration of families to empty pockets and the unavailability of jobs that have been shipped offshore, and they too may have a point. Suicide by drinking or drugging yourself to death for those who are too young to retire but too old to start over and have lost hope certainly points in that direction. Yet I remain obstinately cheerful because I refuse to let the bastards get me down. But that's a default attitude, and attitude on its own changes nothing. My anger stems from a lot of things. One of them is that the Democratic Party forgot who they represented. Blue-collar, white males were once loyal Democrats, and now, having drunk the Kool-Aid, they hate Washington and vote Republican. One of the reasons why is because George Wallace invented the theme of the forgotten man, and Richard Nixon went to school on it and won the presidency with what's known as the Southern Strategy, which in a decade remade the Solid South into a red stronghold. If you're wondering why it worked, consider the rhetorical question then and even yet today asked by Joe Sixpack. Here's his question. Why is the government and Democrats doing so much for these blacks and queers and nothing for me? And doing it with my taxes. That was the start. The continuation was, why are they letting in so many illegals who are destroying our culture and stealing the few jobs left that have not been sent over to China or computerized out of existence? I think they're good questions. In this respect, the Democratic Party missed the boat by not taking on class-based abuses. likely because they feared alienating big business and Wall Street, who in some cases rewarded them handsomely for keeping their mouths shut. The consequence was a sense of abandonment, betrayal, and misdirected rage, which has been well exploited by the right wing and now by Bernie Sanders too. Which sense of outrage is global, as evidenced not only here, but also in France, having a large population of Muslims, with the rise of the French National Front and other hard right-wing parties espousing nativism. This should sound familiar. Think fear-mongering Donald Trump, promising to make us great again and building a wall on the Rio Grande, paid for by the Mexicans, appealing to a base that is largely blue-collar, white working people who have every right to be worried as the world they once knew is gone, and they don't like the looks of a brave new technocracy that has no place for them and maybe not for their children either. But let's not forget that the Democratic Party supporting civil rights and thereby ending American appetite in the South did cost the Democratic Party the once solidly Democratic South, and that to me is a painful reminder that no good deed ever goes unpunished. And now that I've bashed and praised the Democrats for allowing the extremists to take over their party, no, not that. Now I've bashed and praised the Democrats, let me say this about the GOP. The moderates have only themselves to blame for allowing the extremists to take over their party, not protesting being labeled as rhinos and remaining silent while the ideologues took over and wrecked the political process. What should have happened is that the moderates should have found their backbones and refused to appease the far right, as the more they appeased them, the stronger they became and the more dysfunctional our government became. Right now, Bush, Rubio, and now Bloomberg and other moderates are doing what may be too little too late to save the GOP from itself, and they may, not the Trump or Cruz admirers, have to form a third party, as the ideological purists on the far right may not ruin not just their party, but any possibility of governing responsibly. So I'll close by saying what to do. At some point, there needs to be a fight, and I will leave the choice of weapons up to you. Admittedly, I've done little more than talk, but even if talking is a futile gesture, I'm going to do it anyways because I have to do something. But what must precede any fight is one very simple thing. Just as in physics, you have to understand the problem. In politics, you have to know your enemy. Our enemy is a moneyed aristocracy that owns the political class. And I make no distinction between Republicans and Democrats when I say that.
Repeat that last sentence again.
Oh, let me make sure that I exactly quote myself. In politics, you have to know your enemy. Our enemy is a moneyed aristocracy that owns the political class, lacking a sense of what the French call noblesse oblige. We, the people, should assess them in acquiring one. Which means, forget about selfishness being a virtue, forget about Margaret Thatcher's declaration that there is no such thing as society. A family is a micro-society where one learns the basics of give and take. Should we now declare families obsolete? I don't think so. While it's true that general populations can be and often are a collection of warring special interests, that is only because people have the wrong idea that markets and self-interest should decide everything. They should not. Period. If we want to fulfill the promise of American exceptionalism, then we have to prove that both Ayn Rand and Margaret Thatcher are wrong. The hopeful thing is that it's been done 3 times before. Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, took on the trusts. Now, I think he ran as a progressive. Anyways, when he took on the trust, he was a Republican. Later, he ran as a progressive. Franklin Roosevelt pushed through Social Security and the WPA, and Obama managed to push through the Affordable Care Act, although at great political cost. The sobering thing is that it will take a fight. We, the people, may not win, And we, the people, need to get our act together and organize. Let's hope that it's not too late. And no, I have not given in to cynicism, because even though I'm not optimistic, I am angry. And that, believe it or not, is a good sign. That's all I got.
Love conquers all.
Yeah, well, if he starts thinking that way, he's in trouble.
Jim, would you please give a more detailed description of what you consider a worker as opposed to an investor?
Well, a worker is somebody who's dependent on a job and wages, and an investor is one who's dependent on earnings. You know, so, and there's always a built-in conflict of interest between the two. In my lifetime, I've been both, mostly worker, for a very small percentage of time, an investor. The built-in conflict of interest, if that's what you're getting at, is that every time there's a huge layoff in a given company, you can usually see the stock go up because they've reduced cost and increased earnings. And it's hard to argue. I get really sick and tired of people saying, oh, that's class warfare, we can't have that. Well, my view is you may not want it, but it's there. There is a built-in conflict of interest. I mean, workers want to get as big a piece of the pie as they can, and investors, they want the bigger piece of pie. And what it really comes down to is power. Who's got the power to decide how the pie gets cut up? Now, am I off? Have I answered the question for you?
Well, personally, I have always been insulted by the appellate of appellation of worker, and I found it to be, I mean, if you look at an individual, individuals have abilities. An individual can be an artist. He can do his 40 hours, but there's much more to the person than this concept of a worker. What I feel that you are doing, and maybe not intentionally, is you're taking human life and you're reducing it to this subset of economics for the purpose of your talk here, and I don't feel it does service. So if you want to answer that.
Well, my only answer is okay. But it is undeniable in a capitalist system, there is built-in conflicts of interest between those who rely on wages and those who rely on investment for their income. That's undeniable as far as I'm concerned.
Hi, Jim.
Yeah, go ahead.
As you know, Karl Marx predicted that capitalism would end in violent revolution because it basically destroys itself. How do you think this epoch of American capitalism will end?
Well, it could end badly. I hope that it doesn't. But Marx, I think, was a little premature. Capitalism and capitalists have been much more inventive than he ever imagined. I mean, if you look at the history of I don't know, Britain, but certainly in the United States, you see endless labor wars, endless strikes. I mean, even in Michigan, there's any place in Michigan where I come from that you can go at almost any time where there hasn't been strife, which had to do with, you know, labor demanding more money or more rights or a shorter work week, okay, and you know, the investment class, if that's terminology you want to use. But here's where Marx, I think, was what he didn't count on was that the deal is this. If you recall, prior to this populist uprising here, some wag described the political parties as, well, there's a right wing and a left wing, okay, of the property party, right? And the idea is that there's controlling interests behind them, right? And that and we have this mirage on out there where you really have a choice, but you don't. Now you do, and you do because things have gone so badly, okay, over the last 10 years with a bad war in Iraq, okay, and Wall Street blowing up the economy, and people not being able to find jobs, and jobs being shipped over to China, that now the establishment has lost control. What the establishment did, and I think that Marx didn't reckon with, is that if you give just enough ground so that people have something to lose, you pacify them. You write laws, okay, that address themselves, okay, to their concerns, like 40-hour weeks. You do that. But then the issue becomes, then you write draconian laws that say that, well, if Wall Street does this, if Wall Street does this, we'll punish them, right? But then you set up commissions like, I'm blanking on the name right now, SEC. You know, and they have no right, for example, to bring criminal charges. It's only civil cases. Then you understaff them. Then you put people in, okay, who are politically agree with you, and then they're understaffed and they're biased and they look the other way, and then they don't enforce the rules very much. So I think what Marx, to get to your question, what Marx didn't reckon with was how imaginative business could be. And they were imaginative enough to know that when things are bad, you got to give ground to pacify people, and they have. Roosevelt recognizing labor unions in the 30s is a prime example of that. Now you got bargaining power. Okay? And if you give up just enough so that people are pacified, because they don't want to go out in the streets and riot, I mean, that doesn't pay. They just want to live and raise their families, okay? Then what happens? You maintain control. And what we've seen, in my view, over the last 30 years, the idea that our government has become socialistic is exactly wrong. It's diametrically wrong. We've become fascist. I mean, our government is owned by private interests. They've bought everybody in sight. So this argument, and we've been pulled steadily to the right, and the measure, the proof that these established interests that are behind the parties have won, they've dismantled the New Deal. It's almost entirely dismantled. Yeah. Next question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have maybe a good follow-up to what you just said. Did you read in the paper this morning where the Chinese have purchased the Chicago Stock Exchange? And do you think that the Chinese will let us buy into their system in the same manner? And do you think that this is kind of an indictment on our concept of the open or the free market in being a little bit too free?
Well, a little bit is an understatement. I mean, I think the Republican Party made a huge mistake 30 or 40 years ago in their calculation that we have less to fear, okay, from free markets, okay, and big corporations than we do, okay, from big government. I mean, what they forgot is that people are people. I mean, and I hate to sound, you know, like a Christian theologian, but, you know, everybody in this room is a sinner. I mean, it's as simple as that. And to place your trust in people or in institutions who you know are going to abuse their power, because absolute power corrupts absolutely, is a huge mistake. The best you can hope to do is by balancing power. Right now, we have such a huge imbalance of power in this country. Well, the huge imbalance in this country has come about by means of bribery and the other things that I listed, in the talk, and it's put us behind the eight ball. And now, both major parties, or the people who control them, are very upset and they're very worried. Because somebody is going to be held accountable, and they don't want it to be them. My argument is this. The election that you're going to see this time around will be heavily influenced by populism. The big issue is going to be, who are you going to blame? That will be the big issue. Who will they pin the blame on?
With your formula there, you are taking socialism and you're distinguishing it from fascism. Jim, I'm sorry, I can't tell the difference.
Oh, really?
Please explain.
Well, if you want to take socialism to the extreme, you got communism, and then all the means of production are owned by the state.
Doesn't that have to be administered?
Wait. Let me finish answering the question, right? Now, if you want to take fascism to the extreme, okay, the state is owned by private interests. Now, you tell me, which is it? Which model? I mean, I know there's this continuum, and it goes from the hard left to the hard right. I think we're much closer to the fascist extreme than we are the communist extreme.
You're saying that under communism, that in fact the state was not owned, that it was not controlled by corporations?
No.
What about Arm and Hammer?
What about them?
Hammers in control over there.
What about Arm and Hammer?
What about them?
What about all the bankers who basically paid for the revolution in Russia and set it up?
Well, that's a version of history that I probably wouldn't agree with.
Hello. I think the end of the world, as you presented it, was so focused on the United States history. I was wondering if you think about this moment in history in terms of human evolution worldwide, and kind of broaden the focus. Do you have anything to say about?
Oh yeah, I'm going to surprise you. I'm going to agree with Milton Friedman, and I'm going to say that capitalism has done more to lift people out of poverty than any social program you could possibly name. And all you have to do is look at China. It's true. Let me finish. It's true that they're only working for 50 cents an hour. And it's true, okay, that's happened at the expense of American workers who've lost good paying jobs, right? But I believe in capitalism to this extent. I believe in the extent that it does know how to make money. There's absolutely no problem with capitalism being a functional system that knows how to make money. If you think of capitalism as an engine, and if you think of greed as a fuel, it works every time. The problem is this: who gets to cut the pie? That's the problem. And my issue is not with capitalism per se. My issue is, how are the profits shared out?
Mike died, but my question was, what do you see as the trends worldwide, not just, analyzing the Bernie Sanders campaign?
Well, the trend, I think, is towards corporate and big money control of everything. That's the trend that I see. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but that's the trend that I see. It's certainly been going that way here in the United States. And it certainly looks like it's been going that way in Europe with the rise of the multinationals. I mean, I think it's hard to argue that big money is not taking control of everything it can get under its control. They buy governments, they buy lawmakers, and if you interfere with what they're trying to do, they'll say, fine, we'll move elsewhere. And if you want them to move into your location, the first thing they'll tell you is, fine, what are the tax breaks? Other questions, please.
Yes.
Okay. What is your definition of fascism?
The government is owned by private interests.
Don't you have it turned around? Fascism was that government owned major, if not controlling, but not all.
No, I don't have it turned around. And you probably won't agree with this, but this was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's answer to the question of what is fascism. Fascism is where the government is owned and controlled by private interests.
Well, that's not fascism by the economic definition. Fascism is an economic system in which government, I don't know what, Roosevelt could have said that, but he said a lot of things that were wrong, and that's, if you...
Well, I mean, you and I can disagree on whether he's wrong, but that's the definition that I was working under. And as I see it, our government is it's certainly not owned by the people. It certainly is owned by private interests who've sent every dollar they... It's not a one-man, one-vote democracy anymore. It's $1, one vote.
Is your contention then that politicians are bought off by corporate interests? Did I understand you correctly to say that?
Absolutely.
Well, if that's the truth, you would, which I think there's a lot of truth to that, then wouldn't you agree with us who believe that we ought to have a regular changing of the guard in Congress by term limitations, so it makes it more difficult for politicians to be bought?
I'll go further than that. I'll go much further than that. I don't know you from a bale of hay. I do know that you're probably further to the right than I am. I would be perfectly comfortable if my representation was selected by lot, just like juries are. You can only serve 2 years, and you can't make a career out of it. And I'd be perfectly happy with you representing my interests, because I know, even though I disagree with you on many things, you'd be gone in 2 years and you couldn't make a career out of it.
Well, 2 years was a little short, but like 20 years is way too long. And by the way, you can affect the change of a Republican congressman by voting for any one of 3 of his challengers on May.
2 years would be just fine, because you wouldn't have to spend 3/4 of your time begging for money for your next election, which is what they do. And I know you don't disagree with me on that.
I mean, yes, that's a clever idea, to select it by lot. I mean, I would be Bill Buckley's idea. He'd rather be
Look.
the first 100 people in that Boston phone directors and Supreme jerks in Washington. I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't think it would be any worse. I really don't. I think it'd be an improvement. Yes, sir.
It turns out that Bernie Sanders has a medical industry super PAC that has donated $11 million to him.
Yep.
Yet he constantly attacks Hillary Clinton as being the dupe of the corporate establishment and of himself as being anti-establishment. I'm just kind of curious what you think about that dichotomy, as opposed to the comparison of the Democrats versus the Republicans. Because I believe that Bernie Sanders is making a huge mountain out of a molehill in his claim that Hillary Clinton is just as bad as the Republicans.
Well, probably so, but I'm a pragmatist, and if he is of the belief that this is what he needs to do to have a chance at winning, then he should go ahead and do it. And that doesn't mean that you always violate your principles, right? It doesn't mean that you always break the rules, but you never want, in my personal motto is you never want to let a principle or a law or a rule stand in the way of doing the right thing. Obama himself, I often talked about the need to get money out of politics, yet when it came to using the governmental provision for funding, okay, rather than PACs, I mean, he went ahead and did what he thought he had to do so he could match them dollar for dollar, and even better, I think he outspent them. So, in making a judgment on Sanders, I would count that as a very small sin. Yes, sir.
I heard you say, I think, that capitalism created more jobs and increasing wealth for more people than any other form in history. I would venture to say that that's wrong. It was free enterprise, which was the idea of our founding fathers, and capitalism, to me, is greed and lust for power that has grown so great and eliminated the antitrust laws and put all of those moms and pops out of business. I'm not a person who's fond of the terms capitalism or democracy unless it's a representative
Well,
democracy like we have set up.
Albert, I'm happy to explain my definitions, okay? And we don't want to get bogged down in you define it this way and I define it that way. And it's localized. I mean, there is no doubt that when China took the capitalist road, they improved living conditions for the majority of their people. You can't argue with that. They did. You know, I mean, if you take a look at where they were going in the Cultural Revolution, I mean, you had widespread famine. There was no GDP to speak of. Now they're building a navy, and they're challenging us for military supremacy in the Pacific. And they've done it with the money we've sent them, okay, to pay for these 50-cent an hour jobs. Now, Milton Friedman was right. He was definitely right. Capitalism can improve living conditions substantially, and it did in China. Take a look at North Korea. I mean, they are in perpetual famine. Their system is non-productive, you know. They would probably do better with some version of capitalism. We're not going to argue about its definitions. The problem with capitalism is not that isn't that it works. It does. The problem is once you got the pie, how are you going to cut it up? That's one of the big problems, which has led to all of the labor wars and strife that we've had. Also, the big problem with capitalism is, yeah, we raise living standards in China, but at whose expense? You know whose expense. It was the white, blue-collar, working class in this country, okay, who, you know, really were sold a bill of goods. I mean, I can still remember Rubin listening to the crap that was coming out of his mouth, saying, oh, think of all the cheap prices you're going to pay for all the goods coming back from China. Well, what the hell good is it having cheaply priced goods when you don't have a job? You know, yes.
I really appreciated your comments. Two things I'd like to add.
Where you at? I can't find it.
I'm over here.
Okay.
Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican.
Yes, he
Both
was.
the major parties were progressive and reformist.
Okay.
Both Democrats
Okay.
and Republicans at the turn of the century, based on the momentum of the populist movement of
Okay.
farmers. But your point was well made about Roosevelt in that there was a thriving socialist movement in the U.S. There were dozens of socialist mayors and city councils. In fact, I teach history. My textbook points out that only New York had more socialists than Oklahoma in 1910. And the progressive movement was a way to put a lid on that. They were more left of center, and the reforms made by Roosevelt and the like were an attempt to kind of derail, or as you said, give a little bit, and then it calms down the more serious demand. And one last point. I came across an essay by Richard Heilbronner that I think also made one of your points, in that after World War II, capitalism in Europe was pretty much on the ropes. They nationalized everything in all those countries pretty much after World War II. Not in the United States. And his observation there was that in the U.S., the government played the role of a fair playing field. That Marx and others had underestimated the opportunity, or the potential of a government so inclined.
To adapt.
Yes, to adapt, exactly. And to be the kind of mediator of two different interests, as you pointed out, and that the government could be the independent, neither one side or the other, kind of the moderator of the two very distinct interests of labor and capital.
Yeah, let me comment on that. I cannot disagree with you. My contention over the years is that governments, number one, this idea that we have to be either pure socialist or pure capitalist is nonsense. Every government, advanced government, on the face of the earth is an admixture of both. And the issue is not whether, oh, that's socialist, or we're not going to be socialist, or we're not going to be. No, it's what sort of a blending and a mixture are you going to have, right? What's fair and what's not so fair. And there was a lot more socialism, if you will, back in the Roosevelt era, simply because of the fact that, Social Security was an idea that was put, Norman Thomas, who was the socialist candidate, okay, for President of the United States. This was back, I believe, in the Roosevelt era. And he got, I think, like 10 or 15%. But this is a prime example of what you're talking about, adaptation. Here you have the crisis, okay, of all crisis, the thing that Marx predicted. It's 1929. The sky is falling. What are we going to do? We're going to throw them more than a bone. We're going to throw them some beefsteak. We're going to have Social Security. We're going to take the socialist idea and we're going to incorporate it into the democratic platform, and it's going to become a right. So the people who are criticizing certain measures for being socialistic, they need to read their history. If you're enjoying a Social Security check like I am, and like Mary is, and many in this room are, you're enjoying one of the fruits of socialism.
Jim, I have an issue with the term capitalism. You are familiar with who coined the phrase?
No.
Karl Marx.
Okay.
He didn't invent it, but the meaning that we currently have, we get from Karl Marx. So you wish to keep this out of the mire of semantics, but I would say this entire discussion hinges on semantics. Now, you have a background in science, correct?
Yes.
Okay, work with me on this algebraic formula here. Free market economics never conceived of anything but what I would call a fair playing field, a level playing field. Then comes along an unknown, an X factor, which is something that no one would have conceived of, is competing against slave labor. This was done to us by NAFTA and GATT. Now, I would put it to you that the slave labor or socialist collectivist system of China is what has taken apart the economics that we are discussing here. What's your response?
Well, I would say that if Chairman Mao heard it, he'd be spinning in his grave. I would say that he was decidedly against taking the capitalist road. And when he died, they were finally glad to be rid of him because they knew that if they're going to have any GDP at all, any hope for the future, they had to have some features of a capitalist system. Now, it is no accident. 20 years ago, I forget what the name of the reigning premier or president, whatever you call him in China, guess where he shows up? On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Now, if there's a cathedral to capitalism, that's it. And that was a huge signal. The huge signal is we concede. When it comes to making money, capitalism works. The reason that the Chinese are making money these days is not because it's a socialist system. It's because, okay, they've convinced American capitalists to build factories on their land, okay, and exploit their workers.
Slave labor.
Yeah, slave labor. I'll agree with you on the slave labor part, but here is the point.
That's not capitalism.
Capital is building.
Well, look, I'm not arguing semantics. What I'm arguing is fairness. And what I'm saying is that government, this idea that government needs to get out of the way because they can't do anything right and they always screw things up, is dead wrong.
They didn't have to gas.
Let me finish. Let me finish. Let me finish. Now, does government make mistakes? You bet they do. And oftentimes the mistakes are made because they've been bought and paid for by vested interests. But on occasion, government does something right. okay? And when government is doing something right, here's what I think they should be doing. Just like this lady in the back, who I don't know, says, they should be a referee and blow the whistle and make sure that the playing field is level. And what that means is that government should regulate and control and even, yes, have something to say about hours worked, child labor, minimum wage, okay? Because if they don't, you'll have a system, okay, where the United States, a few garden spots, look like the shining city on the hill, and every place else looks like Buffalo, Detroit, and Newark. That's where we're headed. And the reason we're headed is because there's this idiotic belief that free markets, okay, means that we can do whatever we want to do, and if we tear up the social fabric, too bad.
But Toffler's the one who sold us on that.
He didn't sell me. But he did sell me on the proposition that change is coming and it's accelerating. And there are, yes, as I said in the speech, there's a lot of people who say, stop the world, I want to get off. Understandably, because it's come hard and it's come quick.
Hello, Jim.
Yes.
Another question.
Yes, sir.
Do you think the Chinese government, that's still communist, are shaking their heads in disbelief at the stupidity of the Americans?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do, because there is no way on their own that they could have ever bootstrapped up to the level of being competitive with us in the Pacific, okay, if we hadn't sent not just the money, but the technology. And some of the technology that we sent over there, okay, and this happened, by the way, and that's why I said specifically at the beginning, this is an anti-partisan speech. I mean, I can find plenty of rocks to hurl at both Republicans and Democrats. Everybody knows, or should know in this room, okay, about this Chinese mafia group that had all sorts of special clearances, okay, and access to all sorts of stuff, which turned out to be sensitive documentation that was being funneled back to China back during the Clinton administration. And everybody knows, okay, that when it came time for a congressional committee to get together and investigate them, guess what happened? They all vanished and found their way over to China. I can make, I think, a very good case for both major parties in this country selling out the American people.
Okay, I do have a question. This time I didn't realize it had to be a question.
That's fine.
I'm of the opinion that middle classes are not natural. They are created by economic, government, and social policy. Would you agree with that?
I would, and I would say that Roosevelt probably had a big hand in that. But I would also say that I would put it under the heading of noblesse oblige. It's an obligation of the nobility to make sure, okay, that you serve a lot of interests. One of the interests is keeping this economic system stable so you don't collapse, right? And one of the ways you do that is by setting up rules and conditions under which people operate, okay, that make them believe in the system. In other words, if I work hard and play by the rules, I will get ahead, and I will be able to pay for insurance, and I will be able to buy a house, and I will be able to send my kids to college, right? Now, the implied mantra is that, oh, we're sure sorry that all this has happened and you can't do that anymore, but it's really not anybody's fault. It's just one of those things. That's crap. It's not one of those things. It was by design. It wasn't as if people sat down and said, how can we screw the middle class and destroy them? It's just that people sat down and said, how can we make more money without regard to consequences? And that I take sharp exception to.
I believe it was Will Rogers who said, we have the best Congress that money can buy.
Yes, he did.
Hey, getting back to China for a minute, are you familiar with this man named Maurice Strong? Maurice Strong.
I don't know the name.
He just died. He's a fellow that was working for the Americans and the UN to bring about our current situation with China. He just died.
Do you have an estimate? You referred to the last Trump administration as increasing the deficit tremendously. Do you recall how much the Iraq-Iran war cost up through just the end of the Bush administration?
I think the last numbers that I looked at were like $3 trillion.
I thought it was $1 trillion.
No, well, I mean, when you talk about ongoing medical costs, you know, for people who've been, you know.
Well, I'm just the military costs.
Well, military are probably $1 trillion, but when you talk about the follow-on costs, it's probably going to get up between 2 and 3 trillion.
Yeah, those numbers are off in the future, and it's important to make that distinction because the Bush administration, the Obama administration has increased the deficit by $7 trillion. He doubled it. The Bush administration increased it by $5 trillion, but only $1 trillion of that came from war costs.
Well, I would argue that it's 3, but you're right about the increases under Obama. All right. But at the same time,
And those are not military increases. Those are mostly non-military spending.
yeah, I seriously doubt that a Republican counterpart would have done better.
You've got to be kidding.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. Well, I mean, take your choice, right? You extend unemployment benefits, right? Or, you know, you have another Veterans March, okay, on Washington, and you call out the military, and how much is it going to cost
No,
to...
you stimulate the economy, get people back to work.
Well, that's been.
Well, that spends money too. That's Keynesian economics you're talking about.
Stefan Molyneux,
Yes, sir.
are you familiar with Stefan Molyneux?
Uh,
Stefan Molyneux is kind of his own brain trust. He did an analysis of collectivism and came to the conclusion in a very reasoned way that classes don't exist, that there is no class that is legitimate except for the class of intelligence. Now, what is your response to that?
well, you can do anything on paper, right? I mean, on paper, you can develop all sorts of ivory tower systems that look good, right? But my analysis is based on something that at least appears to me works, right? The history of Western nations, at least, okay, is one of strife, strikes, and trouble, right? And the people on the investment side hated it because of the disruptions. They lost money. That's why the strikes worked. And the people on the labor side of it hated it because they were starving to death. They're out of money, okay? And, you know, they got no place to go. Well, to the extent that if you can at least get over this argument, okay, about who gets what, we all agree that capitalism works. You can make money with investment, okay, within capitalism, right? And if you're smart, you find ways to divide it up that at least keeps the lid on, okay, and people are more or less satisfied. Now, what this means is you've got to make deals. Now, and whom gets to make the deals? I say the government gets to make the deals. They get to form the laws. The laws should represent balanced interests between workers and investors. That's what I say. Now, you want a definition of what a good deal is? Both sides think they got screwed. That is what we're stuck with. We are stuck with it. Nobody on the one side is going to ever think they're getting enough, and on the other side, they're always going to think that they're getting paid. I come back to the same argument. People are people, right? And they, they're prejudiced in their own favor, and self-interest rules each and every time. And what you need is a referee. Government is the referee. They come in and you put together laws that more or less satisfy both sides. They both sides, I can live with it. I don't like it, but I can live with it. You, as a union negotiator, know what I'm talking about. And to me, the big problem is we've strayed so far from that. This nonsense that, oh, gee, markets should decide everything and the government shouldn't interfere in nothing. Now, let me tell you this story. When I was still working, and I was teaching math at a community college, I would walk across campus, right? I would hear 3 different languages in the space of 300 yards. I'm not counting Spanish. Now, here is my question. Who's paying for all these Pell Grants?
We are.
You bet. Next question is, why was there never a debate in Congress, okay, for letting all of these people in? Now, when I say that, I'm not anti-immigrant at all. I realize, just like a lot of other people do, if you're going to continue to sustain me and everybody else that's on Social Security, you need to grow the GDP. And for that, you're going to need some growth, and you're going to have to let some people in, okay, who've got skills so they can contribute to the GDP. But this idea that both major parties decided to staff however they staffed the Border Patrol and just let everybody in that came across, and let's not make any mistake about what was really going on there. The reason these people are coming across is because it was oh so good for business to have all this cheap labor. These people never report you. You can get away with not paying them any benefits. You can get away with not paying them any Social Security, right? They loved it. They're never going to report you. Not only that, Mexico loves it because they didn't have to do anything about their maldistribution of wealth problems, which are far more serious than in the United States, far worse. The third largest component, I'm not talking recently, but I know 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the third largest component of Mexico's GDP was money sent back from the United States. Third largest component. Now, I am all in favor of immigration, but when I look at 160 million when I was a kid and over 300 million now, I said, why all these people? Now, and finally, it got out of hand. The people living in border states, where these coyotes are running people across, people are being shot and killed on their property, their schools are being overloaded, their hospital systems are being overloaded, they're up in arms. I don't blame them. I would be too. Why? Because a certain sector of our population loved the profits. That's why. Jim.
Well, I would agree that businesses want the illegal immigrants for certain kinds of jobs, because you have jobs that are minimum wage jobs by definition. That pays $7.25 an hour. They may bring the illegal in, pay them cash, pay them $5 an hour, with no FICA, no FUTA,
That's right.
no federal income tax withheld. And then until we had Judge Justice over in Tyler and Barefoot Sanders judge here in Dallas refused to even let the schools ask students if they were legal or not, the families mostly stayed home. You'd see a rent house. There'd be 7 guys living in it.
Yeah.
And they would work 6 or 7 days a week. They would find jobs where they could do that. And they weren't making a huge amount of money, but when you considered that gross was net, it was not bad. It was more than minimum wage. And they would send everything except what they needed to eat and pay the landlord and keep clothes on themselves, they send it on to Mexico.
Yes.
So that's where that number 3 component
Right.
came from. I used to see them walking down the railroad tracks and staying as obscure and out of sight as possible. They still do. And there's still some of that, but a lot have built up their confidence and they've brought their family up. And so now we have these mixed families with 2 children born in Mexico and 2 children born here, who by the application of that amendment in the Constitution, which on that issue has never been to court, by the way. The question is, do you see that made economic sense on a net basis? Are we coming out ahead by playing that game?
Well, the answer to your question is that for a long time it made economic sense, for businesses that exploited, and that's the word, that cheap labor. It did. But again, it came at a social cost. People in the border states, especially, southern New Mexico, southern Arizona, along the Rio Grande, it got dangerous, And also, well, the drug trade is another issue. But where was I going with this?
On to rebuttals?
Yeah.
No, there was another thought, but it's escaped. It'll come back to me. Anybody else?
You get to sit down.
I get to sit down? Good. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, now it's your turn to talk. If you want to be a speaker, there's a couple chairs up here, so kind of line up, if you will. Go ahead.
Well, I just thought I'd jump up here real quick so I could be first tonight. There are a couple of things that I want to say. I agree mostly with what has been said, but I want to point out, for example, that President Obama called for the end of gerrymandering in his State of the Union speech, and it has been completely ignored, despite the fact that 17 states have enacted fair vote legislation, which means that they now have nonpartisan election commissions so that it doesn't favor the incumbent, and so the elections will be more competitive. And when the elections are more competitive, in the states where this has been done, more people actually show up and vote. So President Obama, in his State of the Union, even though it was the most important thing that he said, in my opinion, was completely ignored when he called for this to be sped up and to get rid of gerrymandering. And where I disagree with some of the comments is I believe that if we have fair and open competitive elections, we have no need for term limits, because I don't mind if someone is in there for 20 years if they're actually honest and doing a good job. I want the power to throw them out if they're not doing a good job. The next thing I wanted to mention is that I know that it's very popular to bash the Democrats and claim that the Republicans are so wonderful on the economy, but let me tell you, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, and according to Bloomberg these are the statistics. Over the last 50 years, Republicans have held the presidency for 28 years. Democrats have held the presidency for 22 years. So that means that the Republicans have held the presidency more years than the Democrats, but the Republicans only created 24 million jobs compared to the 42 million jobs created by Democrats in fewer years in control. The stock market return over the years that the Republicans were in power was 109%. The stock market return under the Democrats, fewer years, is 992%. That means that the GDP annualized under Republicans was 2.7%. Under Democrats, it was 11%. The income growth under Republicans was 0.6%. Under Democrats, it's 2.2%. So I'm sick and tired of these lying Republicans making the claim that the Democrats are the ones that are running us into the poorhouse and destroying our economy, when the reality is that they're the ones that are doing it, and they're putting it in the pockets of the most wealthy. So now, I'm going to read something to you which I find quite interesting, and I did not write this, but I agree with it because I think it's exactly correct. This is a letter to the top 1%. And by the way, the problem that I have with the top 1%, there is no sense of noblesse oblige. What they're really doing is they're killing the goose that laid the golden egg, because does the number 22 mean anything to you? 22 Americans, not families, 22 Americans now have the same wealth of the bottom 50% of the American people. That's not 1%. Okay, worldwide, 62 people, not families, 62 people in the world have wealth equal to 50% of the people on this planet, which is 3.6 billion people. Okay, that's where we are. So this is directed at those people that are at the top who are greedily scooping up the wealth and putting it into their own pockets. You control our world. You've poisoned the air we breathe, contaminated the water we drink, and copyrighted the food we eat. We fight in your wars, die for your causes, and sacrifice our freedoms to protect you. You've liquidated our savings, destroyed our middle class, and used our tax dollars to bail out your unending greed. We are slaves to your corporations, zombies to your airwaves, servants to your decadence. You've stolen our elections, assassinated our leaders, and abolished our basic rights as human beings. You own our property, shipped away our jobs, and shredded our unions. You've profited from disaster, destabilized our currencies, and raised our cost of living. You've monopolized our freedom, stripped away our education, and have almost extinguished our flame. We are hit, we are bleeding, but we ain't got time to bleed. We will bring the giants to their knees, and you will witness our revolution. Okay, now, that is the mood of this country. I can tell from the applause in this room. I'll tell you who said it, then I'm going to sit down. It was Jesse Ventura.
Well, I don't know if you can all hear me. It's a very interesting speech, Jim. Thanks very a lot. I agree with almost every word you said, actually. I think it's indisputable. I stand here as a foreigner, really. I came to this country at age 30, and it was truly wonderful. I mean, it was really late 60s. Engineers were well paid. Everything was going so well. It was unbelievable. Apparently, that didn't sit well with certain people. I think the evidence that capitalism does so well is easily refuted. After the World War II, America was the world's biggest creditor. Now it is the world's largest debtor. Something has obviously gone wrong, badly wrong. And the people that have paid the price are the very poorest, and also the American middle class. They've paid the price for this, what I term to be an economic suicide that this country has been engaged in for 70 years. I think it's a combination of greed and stupidity.
I personally can't, I have to pinch myself to think that a country could have done itself, done this miasma to itself. To me, it's almost unbelievable. You know, if I'd have stood here 30 years ago and said to you, okay, Americans, do you realize that China, communist China, will be funding your country? And they'll be taking 50% of your trade costs or trade deficit in IOUs, and 50% they'll use to buy up your industry. I mean, every week now, something is being, like GE sold its appliance business off in January to China. Now in England, this has been going on apace. Same thing, driven by right-wing governments with the same result. They're basically destroying the country. Now this is what capitalism does. What happens is the few have the money and they get so greedy. The money blinds them. They have no, you look at these people and they have no common sense. Actually, they're sort of driven to stupidity by their avarice. And generally the people say, oh, well, they must have money, they've got brains. They don't have any brains, and that's the problem. They just have greed. And it just goes on. And really, the only thing one can, and what Robert Skidowski said is that America will only wake up when we have two massive crashes. Now, we're on track for another one quite soon, because nothing's changed in the financial system. Still the same, it's not been reformed. This country has been driven by debt bubbles. In the 90s, we had the dot-com debt bubble, that blew up. Now, in the aughts, we had the housing debt bubble, that blew up. And now, because of this debt bubble driven by the Fed, we're going to have another crash soon. Because this country, you have to pay your way in this world. There must be productive investments in productive industries. I mean, this total gambling on the stock exchange is ridiculous, really. All this quantitative easing that the Fed produced went into bumping up assets that were worthless assets. It was not productive business. So we must, as I said many times, we must get back to producing productive business in this country. We must find jobs for our young people. No wonder the young people are so mad. I mean, when I graduated, there were like 10 jobs I could have had. And in America in the 60s, there were lots of jobs available. That's why they came to England to recruit us all, okay? We were productive. We made products. We did things. That's what we must get back to. Now, so I don't think capitalism is such a wonderful system because it runs amok. There must be some constraint on it. And the average person, the ordinary people must stand up and say, no more of this nonsense, really, because there's going to be one more crash and then a disastrous crash. And the real question is, can this country recover? And it's up to the American people to wise up and say, look, now after the war in England, the main phrase being used, I mean, Churchill was a respected war leader, but everyone came back. All the soldiers that had been through the war, been through the Depression, they said, never again. And they introduced a socialist system. And I was a prime beneficiary of it. It worked for me. Housing, education, healthcare. Those are the three things they did. And it was marvelous, and it was miraculous what they managed to do. Okay? And it's all been, with this right-wing government now, destroyed. It's all going. Housing's gone, education's gone, and health is going to go pretty soon and be privatized. Now, America's better get its act together because, I mean, the time is running out. You can't go run up this credit bill forever. And the Chinese, I mean, basically the same thing. They're going to buy all the business, control everything, and then what? You wake up, there's no democracy, and you won't own your own business, your own productive, livelihood. They buy up everything. What's going to stop it?
Well, I enjoyed most of your remarks, and I kind of like the person that preceded me. I don't have many disagreements, but I do have a couple. We do have a class system. I don't care what you cut it. We have a class system, and we use other tools to perpetuate that system. We use race. We use other peripheral type issues to divide people and create an environment so the people with the money can get what they want, and we pay for it. And I don't know when we'll wake up and start doing something about it. The issue you talked about is true. White blue-collar workers are angry, but they're not the only one. There were African Americans and other people who were working also during that time. Now, if you were talking about before 1960, you would be absolutely true. But after 1960, the manufacturing industry changed and it integrated, and you had all ethnic groups that had a high school education work in those kind of industries. So it's not just white blue-collar men. And that's one thing I think we need to rethink about. The point that you made about the government is supposed to be referee, that's what it's designed to do. But it too has been manipulated. I believe Adam Smith was the disciple that we use for capitalism in the United States a great deal. I know Karl Marx spoke about it in Das Kapital, but that's what most people quote. And capitalism in and of itself is okay, but it has to have someone refereeing it. They can't do what they want to do, and that's why they don't want the government involved, so they can do what they want to. And then, you know, we are, I guess, all of us are somewhat greedy. I look at some of the ways that we vote, and it's greed, but the little bit that come to us is crumbs. And so they better off. The other thing that I think that is our education system. In the 60s and 70s, there were some terrific writers that was writing about, and since I was just out of college, I could really relate to what they were saying. The author pointed out that the public higher education system was designed to train people to do jobs and to obey. If you think about it, even A&M and UT was in that era. Of course, Prairie View was in that era. And if the people who wanted their children to learn to think and to govern the country went to the Ivy League schools. And so, you know, we had a number of private schools, SMU, Texas Christian University, Rice University, and others that, you know, that their children couldn't go to the Ivy League school, they sent their children to those schools. And they were taught that they would be leaders. While in the public university system, we were taught to do a job and be obedient, and you know, everything would be all right. And that education system is hurting us today. In mid-60s, they wrote about, my generation in particular, that we were the silent generation in the 50s, and the young college students became radical and looked at what our parents were doing, and we challenged it and questioned it. And that created a whole another kind of revolution in the country. And they pointed out that most people who were taught, I don't want to step on nobody's feet, but even the engineers, at Prairie View, they tried to take, you know, they had to take economics, history, and a number of things so they could think a little bit. But they did think, and engineering is not an easy field. It's a lot of math and a lot of other things that's involved in it, but it's a narrow focus. And many engineers don't get involved in the political and economic things like some people are doing now. In medicine, even teachers were taught to just teach the book. When I got my first job, the superintendent said, "You be certain, you teach the book. Don't go by what you think, you teach the book." So the book don't really help you a great deal in history or economics or political science or sociology, because it's all written to program you a certain way. So we got to learn how to think out of the box. We got to learn how to recognize when we are being lied to, and we got to get beyond whatever ism that we have that cause us to just continue to support people who hurt us. And it's true, there are Democrats. Most of the Republicans were Democrats, particularly in Texas. They switched from the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was too liberal for them, and went Republicans. And, in the East Coast and other places, it's kind of competitive, but, there were certain people who were Democrats and certain were Republicans. But the South changed. And so in the South, that's why we have the weakest education system, because they don't want children to think. They want them to do what they're told to do. And that's what's hurting us right now. So I think the debt thing, and a lot of people, I know a lot of debt has accrued since 2009. But most people forget about the $700 billion for bailout the banks was not, President Obama was not president when that was done. No, he was not when that law was passed. The thing was Paulson set it up, and he didn't do much to change it. It was put in place.
While Bush was still in office.
It was. That's you guys. You think what you want to, but I'm talking about facts. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay. So, and then we passed $800-something billion as an Economic Recovery Act. And we passed the Affordable Health Care Act, which is called something. But as far as new program, Congress hasn't given him any new programs. He's asked for programs that would create jobs, infrastructure, research and development, retraining for these people who have lost their job. But Congress didn't give it to him. And but we still have people think the way it is. I'm saying we, the people, have got to recognize that we are the people. And we have a responsibility to get beyond our own bias of whatever it is that keeps us in a narrow, tunnel vision, and think about it, ask the question, what's best for our nation and for all of us? We need a level playing field for everybody. I don't share the same opinion about, I know immigration is an issue. I know it's being used and the people are being manipulated. And I also understand how we got involved with China and how we gave them privileges that we didn't give other nations. And now we owe them a lot of money, and they're buying up some of the best real estate in the country. So I think we got to wake up and get beyond our narrow visions, and sometimes it may be race, it may be gender, but whatever it is, we aren't going to get out of this problem unless we start thinking about all of us as we the people. Thank you.
Hello, comrades. Welcome to the New World Order. People, get ready. There's a train a-coming. It's picking up passengers to the TPP. Okay. Wow. So somebody's angry here. Everybody's angry. So we feel the angst. We got all this different... It's kind of vague, though, because we have different reasons. Almost everybody in this room has a slightly different reason. Unless you go to the Democratic convention or the Republican convention, then you're in step with a bunch of other people. But basically, we know something's wrong. Now, anger. I don't know about anger. Anger, I think, is a negative emotion. How would I define that? Anger has a purpose. Every emotion that we have seems to have a very good survival purpose. What I call negative emotions are emotions that are sustained. They turn in on yourself. If you have anger for more than a certain period of time, in other words, a period of time where you can do action, it will become toxic. It will hurt you. It will hurt everybody you come in contact with. So don't be so proud of your anger. Just because you're, spent the last, 15 years since 9/11, not being angry, and all of a sudden you say, and you're angry. Don't be so proud of it. Anger is a transitional thing if it's going to be positive. Anger is to do something. It gives you extra adrenaline. Adrenaline will kill you if you have it constantly. So here we have all this anger. We have angst, we have anxiety. So I'm trying to look at this from a slightly different perspective. You can hardly argue with Jim. Jim researches his stuff very well. I'd like to take a slightly different perspective, however, of different trends. We hear a lot about labor versus business and Democrats versus Republicans, even though in the beginning you said you weren't going to do that. But there's other currents. This is not a two-dimensional game. It's not even a three-dimensional game. This is even a one person is at least 5 or 6 dimensions, any way you want to look at it. A whole society, a whole world, a whole interconnected world, a universe has many dimensions in it. So let's think about a couple of things. I'm going to throw them out here and see how they fit in. How about all these soldiers committing suicide? We kind of forgot about that, but this is the reason I bring it up, because nobody questions that. Everybody knows that's happening. Now, do they have it worse than they had in World War II? I don't think so. It's just, there's something going on here. We can speculate what it is, but there's something really going on here where a young man finds that he's been so betrayed, he betrayed himself, he's been thrown on drugs, they're killing themselves, Now, there's something really rotten here going on. Okay, one point of semantics, I'm going to start rambling. It's not the 1%. Like you quoted Jesse Ventura, it's 1% of 1% of 1% of 1%, and it's times. I mean, you start adding those zeros. So I think it's a really misleading slogan, and it has deleterious effects when we want to attack the 1%. We might be attacking what's really holding our country up. You know, your average millionaire, which is like a thousandaire in the 50s, is in the 1%.
You're absolutely correct. I usually say the 0.001%.
Good. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. We're in agreement here, but there's a big world here, and a lot of media going on, and that slogan is being used to pit us against each other. Like Calvin said a minute ago, we are being played against each other. So I better wrap this up. What's the big trend here? It's not an accident. I agree with that. But there is a new world order here. This country was meant to go down. Down. We were too proud. We believed the bull they've been telling us, that this is a country by the people, of the people, for the people. Nobody ever wanted that. Here's my own original thinking, even before I knew about 911. This system relies on the poor people. You have to be poor. In other words, who's going to clean your gutter? That's much more important than who's going to play golf with the president. I mean, it doesn't make the headlines. Who's going to fix your roof? Who's going to go down in the sewer in the middle of the street? You have to be poor. If everybody, all of a sudden, Bernie Sanders gave everybody $20,000, $100,000, whatever, nobody's going to go clean my toilet. Nobody's going to fix my refrigerator. What's going to happen? I'm getting too old to do all this myself. So the system relies on poor people. But now the modern sophisticated system, it's a psychological problem. So what I'm trying to get to is it's a worldwide psychological attack on us. We're being fed a lot of propaganda, and I can't get into the whole thing right now, but it's bigger than the coincidence theory. Oh, we're just so stupid. It's just an accident. There's certain people that just don't really want to work. They want to stay on top. They want their blood to stay on top. That's the old royalty system. We still have that. But here we have this veneer of, that you're really well informed and you're really free, whatever that means. I don't know, it's like French fries or something. I don't know. But it's going to disappear. So, don't they know it's the end of the world? It ended when they signed TPP.
Well, Jim has been maintaining that he didn't want to get into semantics, and I'm saying the entire debate is over semantics. And I've tried to have this debate with college students before and grad students. Our education system educates socialists. And you try to talk to people about individual rights, and they can't even understand it. So here we are, and I mean, people get offended when they say, our universities are leftist. They are leftist, folks. Most of America right now is leftist. In their semantics. You sit and talk about capitalism. That's Marx's term. Why not talk about free market economics? Why not talk about doing a day's work and getting paid a good day's wage? No, you're talking about classes and class warfare. Stepan Molyneux,
I wouldn't be talking about classes.
I disagree with Molyneux on a few things, but I believe him when he says that all this business about classes is all illusion. There's no reality to it. The only real class that has any clout is IQ. And people can manage. It's when you start taking on and wearing these class as if that's you. It's when you believe it. Now, as far as, Jim's trying to analyze a problem here, and I would characterize this as the blind man and the elephant, or maybe the blind men and the elephant. I've been working on that elephant for a while. At one time in the far distant past now, I was actually a founding member of a pachyderm club, at which firsthand and up close I learned that in the Republican Party, they don't want to talk about individual rights. They want you to put that piece of garbage candidate back in. They want support for people who didn't deserve to be dog catcher. And we're supposed to report, we're supposed to support them because we're good Republicans. And that didn't last very long. It's, as far as, I keep hearing stuff about redistribution of wealth. If you go down Marx's list, 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, we've got so many of them right now. The one thing that really puts the lie to Marxism is, I think it's plank number 5, a central bank. What does that have to do with we the people? What does that have to do with populism? You start thinking about it. Marx was funded by the bankers. He was promoted by the bankers. Marx Engels, that was funded by the 0.001% of that time. And Cleon Skousen, W. Cleon Skousen, wrote a book, The Naked Communist. He turned right around after he finished that, and he'd done the research, and he wrote a book called The Naked Capitalist. Why is that? In 2000, at the vote fraud convention in Cincinnati, I met Terry Hayfield, a former union organizer for the microchip industry. And Hayfield gave me an earful on what he called the permanent revolution. He said, here we are in our Republican-Democrat system, and we have two wings of a predatory bird that are being driven by the permanent revolution. The permanent revolution is not seen by either party, yet it controls both. And what did he mean by the permanent revolution? It is the radical capitalists who are pushing this Hegelian dialectic of right and left. I'm sitting here listening to Mike Gauss a few weeks ago talking about right-wing Muslims. I beg your pardon. Right-wing Muslims? They're the ones who are promoting the jihad? Well, that plays real well because we're used to semantics. This whole game is semantics, folks. We're being controlled by semantics. A lot of things that Jim brought up. I would say this is, I have a feeling that the 0.001% have made a shift. And I think what we're going to be seeing next, and we're already in the midst of, is a global currency reset, where you're going to see currencies all over the world, maybe as much as the currencies of 180 countries, changing in value. And this could happen very rapidly, and we could have a bank holiday. It ain't going to be no holiday for anybody but the bankers, believe me that. When this is all said and done, they're going to take actions which are going to be to help all of us, but it's really going to help the 0.001%. So I'm saying the permanent revolution is alive and well. Carol Quigley talked about it in Tragedy and Hope, but if you want to know the outline, the real skinny, go to a book called The Fabian Freeway. I don't remember who the author was. And you will find the clues to what is being pursued. The conspiratorial view of history is the more correct view of history. Thank you.
Well, this is certainly an interesting topic, and I thought you gave a good presentation. Don't agree with everything, of course. We wouldn't be here if it were that way. Completely agree with the Jesse Venturi quotation that you read. I've been a fan of his for a long time, and his conspiracy theory program, which pulled out a lot of interesting things out of the hat. Now, there's one thing that I want to point out, and this is a viewpoint of mine, and I know a lot of people totally disagree with this. Humanity is very lowly evolved morally and spiritually worldwide. We are a rogue species going in every direction at once. The country, as it was founded by a group of relatively intelligent, educated people who had a common idea. And they realized that if everyone got everything they wanted, well, I mean, if anyone got everything they wanted, that would be an evil result because it would not be a compromise. And that's why the one issue I totally disagree on is letting people stay in office year after year after year after year if they're doing things right. Well, it might be right for you and not for somebody else, and that breaks down that sense of compromise. Plus, we've got thousands of other people out there who can bring fresh views in. Now, one thing that I see as a big problem on the earth, particularly because of the degenerate moral factor worldwide, the lack of cohesion, is massive overpopulation. When we started the criminal law class in law school, we got to murder, of course, and there were two cases that were both almost identical. One, a British ship was in a storm and it went down, and they put people in the lifeboats. The same with the American ship. It went down, they put people in the lifeboats. However, in each case, there were not enough lifeboats for everybody, and the captain had to say, you can't get on the boat, and you can't get on the boat, and the others got on the boat. And both of them were tried for murder of the people that were not allowed on the boat. He was an experienced captain. He knew that if they'd all gotten in the boat, they'd all drown because the boats would sink in that weather. So he had to make a choice and make a decision, and he did it. And those who were in the boats lived, and the others didn't. Well, in England, I think, if I recall right, the holding was justifiable homicide, and I think in the United States it was either manslaughter or murder, I forget which. But these are different people with different viewpoints and all kinds of different circumstances. In this country, we are beginning to be overwhelmed by indigent people. We cannot handle it. We do not have the resources. They're bringing in more and more people to take away any jobs that are there, and we're having higher and higher crime rates right around here, everywhere. All over the city, crime rate is just skyrocketing. I think that if we allow immigration into this country any more than is absolutely necessary, that we're going to sink. We're in that lifeboat right now. I think Europe is sinking. I think they were stupid to allow all the immigration that they have allowed. And look at how many people in Germany, how many women are being raped every day practically by these indigents that are coming into that country. Many of them, from their moral standards, have very little consideration for the value of a woman. That's one thing in Western society. We're far beyond the Middle East, in my opinion. And I think we need to realize these things. I think that we need to realize we are in a sinking ship worldwide. And the higher the education level of a population, the lower the birth rate. Well, our education in this country has been just decimated. with like outcome-based education, get a copy of the book and read it. It was done on purpose to bring the creative thinking away from the classroom and teach people to fit into this slot and that slot and that slot by the capitalist corporations. Now, when I was growing up, I didn't hear that term capitalism very much. I heard free enterprise, and that's what our founding fathers gave us, is a governmental structure that there were few enough people that we could govern that ourselves instead of turn it over to so-and-so who comes and says, oh, yes, Johnny, I believe in that so much. I'll fight for that in Congress. BS. They're doing what they're paid for by the corporations. Capitalism is an evil term, in my opinion. Free enterprise is a great term, and when it becomes focused on the amassing of capital, then greed and lust for power are taking over and creating sociopathic minds. And you can see that in the corporate structure that's ruling the world today. These people don't give a tinker's damn about the welfare of humanity at all. Our founding fathers did, and we are allowing that to just slip through our fingers. Again, I'm going to refer to Yuri Bezmenov. Go on YouTube and watch his interviews. He made it very clear that when they decide to move into a country and convert it to communism, the first step is to tear down the moral fiber of the country. They allot 15 to 20 years to do that. In Moscow, they were astounded when in the United States it only took 10 years. The moral fiber of this nation has gone straight to hell. And there's a lot of just greed and lust for power. And we are so stupid to fall into the, like I've used this analogy so many times, being roosters in a cockfight of Republican, Democrat, left, right, I want all this, I want all that. And the other guys are just totally evil because they're the opposite of what we believe. The idea of compromise and working together to move forward on agreements is gone with these radical one way or the other viewpoints. And we need to get rid of that. We need to rise up out of the little dirt floor in the stadium as the roosters in the cockfight trying to kill one another, and we're all going to be roasted if we're in that cockfight, and see the higher picture of what's going on this planet. It is beyond just our governmental levels. It goes beyond that into extremely high money. The banking system has been mentioned several times. That's one of the most evil structures on this earth. I would advise everyone to get a copy of Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and read it. It should be mandated in school for every student. It's just too important to miss the truth about what we are being faced with in this world, not just this country. And we're sound asleep. And I think Americans are more asleep than a lot of people are, unfortunately. Anyway, Tom was looking at me like my time's up, so.
My last one standing. No one else wants to say anything? All right. I want to thank our speaker for being here tonight. I think he did a terrific job. You were talking about concepts of what we need to do in the future. I think that I was a union organizer. I was a chairman of a labor union for 20 years, so I've been on this game somewhat. But in my view, for what it's worth, I think that corporations have become bigger than countries. They've left our country. They rule the roost. It's part of the problem we have, and that because of that, we have reached a point where we can't control. We've lost our way. Unions are busted. They're broken. They can't negotiate. Someone wants a wage increase. The corporation picks up town and leaves, goes overseas. That's part of the problem. And and we're buying cheap labor, and our trade deficit is enormous. And as a result, we're in trouble. It's been brought up here tonight about the debt we face and the debt we have and what we can't pay for. So we got to change things. And to me, the answer is we need to get Congress to act in certain things. One of them is to get corporations to pay for what would you call it, tariffs on corporations overseas that are Apple, for example, produces everything in China and sells it here. We don't have any jobs here to produce anything. So they should pay the difference in labor costs, the difference in environmental protections, the difference in transportation costs to sell things here and produce it in another country. If that were to happen, you'd have more jobs here. You'd be able to survive. No economy can work unless you have both manufacturing, production, and sales. If you lose one aspect of it, you lose it all, and that's what's happened, and that's what has to be corrected. We have a Congress that's bought and paid for by corporations. We know that, and as a result, you can't get them to do anything. So what will they vote for? In my view, they'll vote to get free airtime the last 90 days of an election. Why? Because they'll get free, they'll get to keep their money, plus they get free airtime. They don't like spending all their time raising money, which they do now. And once they have free airtime, some challengers will be able to beat some incumbents because they'll have free airtime too. And when that happens, they'll all wake up and they'll represent the people that elect them instead of representing the people buying their vote in Washington. And if that were to happen, then we could get tariffs on corporations, and we could even shorten the workday in this country. We do a lot of things. But we can't do anything as long as we're strangled with money running everything, and that's my point. Anyway, I give this back to our speaker. He gets the last word in all of this.
A lot of good comments, thank you. Let me start with Jim, where I blanked. What I blanked on was that you asked me about illegals, and what I blanked on was that right now the population of illegals is about roughly the size of the state of Ohio, about 50th maybe. And if you were to ask me, what do we do about them, I think you can't break up families, and the numbers are just too huge. So you're going to have to find a pathway to citizenship and residency. And I'm not going to quibble on terminology. But beyond that, I think we do, I forget who said it, you need to put a lid on immigration. But we also need to keep in mind, you need to grow the GDP, you do need skills, okay? Some people you want to allow in, just like other countries do, because they got something to offer, they can start businesses, they create jobs. I'm not against good immigration. I'm against bad immigration where people come across the border because they want to take advantage of benefits that they got nothing to offer. That seems fair to me. Okay. All right, let's see. Oh, as far as textbooks are concerned and obedience, manipulation, yeah, I mean, if there's the notable absence in our textbooks, it's intentional. The labor history of this country is almost entirely absent from textbooks. There's this great man theory that the president was in and then he did this, and then there was a great white fleet that went across the Pacific, da-da-da-da-da-da. But there was a huge copper strike that Mother Jones came into in Michigan's northern peninsula. There was great unrest, okay? There were sit-down strikes in Flint, Michigan, okay, back in the 30s. There were the Haymarket riots in Chicago, okay, where people got gunned down by the Chicago police, okay? We are the only country in the world that does not have a May Day celebration in honor of labor people. Now, that doesn't make me a socialist or a communist, but it does make me an individual who believes in a balanced approach, like Fox News says. Let's tell the whole story. Let's tell how ugly it was, and let's tell about the sufferings and the privations, okay, and the excesses, the wretched excess of we won't get hung up on terms, on capitalists, okay, we're bleeding people. There were, and now they're bleeding people in China. There are sweatshops over there. Okay, so there's that. The textbooks need to be fixed. Oh, Hank brought up something about veterans. Here's what I have to say about that. I think that anything that's been lacking in the way of care for veterans is shameful and needs to be fixed. But there's another question. The other question is, why is it that it is only the children of blue-collar, working-class people who are fighting and dying? Why? Does anybody have an answer to me for that? Are people with money better and they should be exempted? Back in my father's generation, the people who were in the upper classes, they were the first to volunteer because they didn't want to be characterized as slackers. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm not. Back in Vietnam, there were safe havens, okay, for all sorts of people. One of them was the Air National Guard. All right? Now, if you think I'm being partisan, I'm not. Yes, a former president, George Bush, was in the Air National Guard. They were flying obsolete jets, which meant that they couldn't be called for duty, okay, in Nam, okay? Guess who his wingman was? Lloyd Benson's kid. Now, I want somebody to tell me that this system isn't corrupt. It is. And I make no apologies for saying that. The very idea that you can exempt yourself, okay, from the responsibilities, however dangerous they might be, of citizenship, while at the same time enjoying all of the benefits, is un-American. All right, so there's that. And then, let's see. Oh, the idea of that class distinctions are an illusion. No, they're not. They are not. If you read American history, you will see plenty of blood and guts and violence, okay, that were fought over class distinctions. Now, when I was in Detroit in 1967, the city went up in flames. There were people, many blacks amongst them, okay, who believed that Martin Luther King was dead wrong because the man was just throwing them a bone, had co-opted the civil rights movement, okay, and they'd put these various laws in effect. But what was really required was what Malcolm X was calling for, revolution. I didn't agree with him, but I can tell you, if that wasn't class warfare, I don't know what the hell is. It was class warfare. We had tanks rolling down the streets. We had guys emptying out 50 caliber machine guns. A lot of people were dying on both sides. But to argue that class distinctions and class warfare in this country in particular is an illusion is not right. It's been with us from day one. From day one, it has been with us. The Constitution originally created classes. Women could not vote. There's a class for you. Blacks could not vote. There's a class for you. In fact, if you didn't have property, you couldn't vote. And there were any number of Southern politicians who argued that the Constitution was not an expansive document, it was a restrictive document that intentionally had established classes of people who are not qualified for the rights of citizenship. I don't agree with them. But I do not agree with the statement that class distinctions are an illusion. No, they're not. Our whole history is filled with battle after battle, okay, which were class conflicts, usually over money, usually over rights to citizenship. The suffragettes, for example, the right to vote. Okay, and let's see, what else? Albert made the point that banks are bad. Boy, do I agree with you, Albert. they're absolutely, Bernie is correct. The Congress does not tell the banks what to do. Wall Street tells Congress what to do. I don't think there's any denying that, given the amount of money that's in politics, not to mention the resistance that you see to get money out of politics. And let's see, I guess I'll finish with one more. But I do think, yeah, that's the last thing I wanted to finish with. We were talking earlier about capitalism's, or the capitalists, whatever term you want to use, or the free market people, ability to adapt to conditions. Well, when they saw that blacks were no longer going to settle, okay, for what they'd settled for back in the 30s, and this was after World War II, and on into the 50s when the civil rights movement started to gain a footing, what did our government do? They pushed through civil rights laws and they sided with Dr. King. All right? That's an adaptation. And the adaptation was because the alternative of not adapting was they feared that Malcolm X would gain a large enough following, okay? And they would rather deal, okay, with the disruptions that occurred. Now, one of the disruptions that occurred is that the Democratic Party lost the entire South. They did. Lyndon Johnson signed that civil rights bill in 1963, in large part to the civil unrest that was ongoing with black people. And the Southern strategy was launched. The Republican Party was brilliant because they adapted. And the way they adapted is they sent coded messages and they told, okay, the white power structure in the South, we agree with you and we're on your side. Did they not? And the disruptions in the black community were calmed and quieted. Why? Because progress was being made. There was a Voting Rights Act, and the federal government came in and forced the vote. But when they came in and they forced the vote, then what did the white power structure in the South do? They hated it, and that hatred goes all the way back to the Civil War. And that's why the South is red today. But I bring this up because I think it addresses itself, okay, to a number of the comments that were made. This is a prime example of how the power behind the parties adapts. And they adapt in such a way to do what? Maintain economic stability, because if you don't, it'll cost you money. Not only will it cost you money, you may even lose control. And I'll close with this last thing. There's two things that the powers behind the parties want. Thing number one is they want stability, economic, so they continue to make money. But the other thing they want is control. And this brings up the issue of, gee, these people on the right will argue the government can't do anything right? Yet they're running for office. So why do you want to join this bunch of incompetents? I will tell you why. Because they want to maintain control. And that's what it's all about. It's all about power. People are people, always has been, always will be, okay? And a good deal is when both sides feel like they got screwed. Thanks.
Well, that's it. We're going to retire to the room next door. We'd stay till 10:30, that's when they close, so we got time, and you can carry on the conversation with our speaker. And thanks for coming, and see you next week.
Is this your first time here? What do you think?